Hello there, I'm Brian Taylor. Down the years you may have seen me on the telly or heard me on the wireless, but this is different. This is the Brian Taylor podcast, brought to you by the Herald. Today,
Scotland needs to be independent. We'll have the potential to be a successful independent country. And, at times of transformational change across the globe, sometimes though that is reflected in the democratic changes within the state.
This is one which I particularly don't like, because I think this is focusing on young people to try to say to them, you will have a vaccine before you can go and enjoy going to a nightclub.
There's no consensus being developed on how you fund that. And so what we have is a very clumsy mechanism that will tax hard-working families.
Hello there, I'm Brian Taylor and welcome to my latest Herald podcast. I'll begin in a now traditional fashion with a plug for annual subscriptions to all the magnificent Herald coverage that you can get on the various platforms. You get 20% off, a fifth off if you mention this podcast, basically, by putting in the slug line Herald Pod 2021 when you subscribe. Please do. Annual subscriptions are available, of course, and I would thoroughly encourage them. Quite a week, eh? Quite a week, incredible week. A new UK-wide tax from the Prime Minister to cover health and social care in England, but with a disputed assurance that Scotland will get a fair share. And Holyrood, the First Minister, introduced a programme for government, loads of details on the economy, health, education, etc., but also announcing that work is now officially underway by civil servants on a new prospectus for independence. And MSPs are just about to vote in a couple of hours' time on COVID passports for nightclubs and big events. Again, hugely contentious. To discuss all that, I'm joined by a very distinguished trio of MSPs. Welcome to Fiona Hyslop from the SNP, to Miles Briggs from the Conservatives, and to Claire Baker from Labour. Welcome all. But first, David Ball from the Herald. David, that new tax announcement, let's go up with that first. New tax announcement from the PM has caused, to say the least, huge controversy. Just remind us of the details, if you would.
Yeah, that's right. As you alluded to, the UK government has put forward a new health and social care tax to improve services and cap costs, at least in England. Despite the Tory manifestos ruling out such a rise, it will begin as a 1.25 percentage point rise in national insurance before becoming a separate income tax in 2023. It's expected to raise 1.1 billion a year for the NHS in Scotland. But SNP MPs in Westminster have opposed it, labelling the tax regressive, warning it could potentially harm those on lowest incomes more or harder, basically. The money will, in England at least, cap how much people are paying for social care. No one's sort of arguing that there needs to be more funding for social care. And separately, the Scottish Government highlighted their plans to set up a national care service as part of their programme for government on Tuesday, which will be a centralised system, which Nicola Sturgeon said will be a fitting legacy from the trauma of the pandemic, adding it will be one of the biggest achievements at Holyrood, showing just the ambition and how widespread these plans are potentially going to be.
David, thanks very much indeed. We'll bring you in later, of course, in the discussion. If you're a Hyslop, let's go straight to you. What's wrong with £1.1 billion extra for health and social care in Scotland? Why are the SNP opposed to this proposal?
Well, the issue is it's a bad tax. Even Paul Johnson, the director of the Institute of Fiscal Studies, has said why they're using a bad tax instrument to do this. It's a regressive tax, and it will hit the poorest the most, and also the youngest. So fairness in the tax is one issue. The allocation of funding to Scotland as our fair share is another issue. And what will do in terms of policy when this is clearly already quite divergent and different approaches to the care service. So absolutely, investment in health is something we support and always have done. In fact, our track record in government shows that we've done this. But the means by which they are doing this will cause many hardworking families, many young people in particular, a great deal of hardship. And if you're embarking on something as big as this, even on an English scale, the funding the care service, a social contract is really important between those that benefit from this, those that pay for it, and a whole societal view is needed. And that's why progressive taxation, if funds are needed, is a way of doing it. But there are other ways. And I, in the Programme for Government debate yesterday, said, why are they not using a windfall tax on the COVID crony contracts that the Conservative have allocated? That would be a way that you could get funding, which is probably more equitable than what they're proposing.
Thanks very much, Miles Briggs. This cannot be comfortable for you as a Conservative. It breaches the Conservative manifesto, albeit not one you stood on, but one that your party stood on for the UK election. And you have that argument there from Fiona Hyslop that it's going to be penalising the poor, when it'll actually be in some cases relatively wealthy families who will benefit by not having to sell their large houses.
I think the Prime Minister summed up the point when he said that none of us had the pandemic in our manifestos, and all three of us who have been in the Parliament over the last 5 years will know the pressures which health and social care are under, and the vital need for investment to recruit more staff, but actually just to deliver services. At FMQs today, for example, we're hearing about how our ambulance service is now in crisis in Scotland. So I think the long-term sustainable funding of our health and social care services is where we need to actually get funding. And I didn't hear from Fiona any credible plan for where that money will come from. And that leads me to the creation of a national care service, because I think there's more questions over what that's going to look like. I sit on a local government committee, and already there's concerns over what this will be. Will this be a full power grab from local government? And we're now seeing social care, we're now seeing children's services potentially coming into this. Now, all of us agree around the need to come out of this pandemic better, to actually try to make our public services work better. But we need to also be realistic about where funding is needed. And I think the Conservative Party down south, and I welcome the fact, are putting our money where our mouth is to try to do something about this huge.
But it's not your money, is it? You say you're putting your money where your mouth is. You're putting the money of hard-working individuals around the whole of the UK initially to pay for what we expected to be a care service in England. But then the details emerge that actually in the first year or so, at least, and probably longer, it's going to go for the backlog in the health service before it ever goes to care. So you're putting somebody else's money to pay for something that is not even what was promised.
Well, everyone working in the health service and trying to access health services at the minute will know that that money's vitally needed if we're going to deliver. We've got record waiting times, and that money will have to re-establish services. I think that's one of the key things which, when I meet with my own health board here in Lothian, they need that additional resource if we're going to get people through and get the backlog cleared. And at the minute, they're very concerned about what that looks like, but they certainly know more resources will be key to that.
But of course, the First Minister had already announced £1 billion for NHS recovery in Scotland from our revenue base, and that has already been announced and set out long before this announcement just this week as to robbing the care funding from the NHS and ICONs into the health service. So it kind of doesn't wash. But
brief answer, Miles Briggs, and then Claire Baker.
Well, the key question is how we're going to fund all this additional work, and this is an additional £1.1 billion. I hope the Scottish Government will commit all of that going to our NHS, and the social care reforms we're going to see, there's no price tag attached to them. So this will be very welcome, I think, for ministers, what they're putting forward. We don't really know what they're actually suggesting. Is this National Care Service going to be clinical standards? Is it going to be workforce planning? I welcome both of those. If it's going to be a full-blown, separate public National Care Service, then that's going to cost at least £3 billion. And ministers just aren't outlining what they plan to deliver. And so I think we need a bit of clarity as soon as possible on.
Thanks, Miles. Thanks very much. Claire Baker, you've been very patient.
Good afternoon, Brian. It's been an interesting discussion so far. There are points that both MSPs have made that I agree with. The national insurance rise at UK level is a regressive tax, and it's quite clear it taxes hard-working people. It doesn't look at unearned income and wealth, and I think that's what's made it so unpopular. I think the government, they did break a manifesto pledge by bringing this forward, and I think it is problematic. The recognition that they do have, we all have a responsibility to tackle the social care issue. We have an ageing population, everybody needs that kind of support, but the way in which the UK government are approaching it, I think, is unfair. And I think there's not a consensus either around as big a challenge as having to meet the social care challenge. There's no consensus being developed on how you fund that. And so what we have is a very clumsy mechanism that will tax hardworking families. As Fiona said, it will tax the younger people in our society, while those sitting on land, property, wealth less than land and in property will not be having to contribute towards this.
But do you accept that if you tackle some of the care demands, you can perhaps lessen pressure upon the NHS, that the two can be interconnected in that sense?
I don't completely accept that, to be honest. I think the care, obviously they are linked, but it's the ageing population that is putting the pressure on the care demands. And we want to make sure our ageing population have healthy, long lives. That is what all of us want to achieve. But we need a social care system to support that. It is a huge challenge for all political parties to think, how do we fund this? How do we make it equitable? How do we make it equitable across the generations? And I do have concerns the approach that's been taken by the UK government is the wrong approach. I understand what the problem they're trying to solve, but it's the wrong approach. And it also goes back to, when we had the financial crash, the Conservative government took an approach that put the burden of dealing with that onto the poorest people in our society. Again, it was an inequitable approach. And now we're coming through this crisis. Obviously, the country is facing huge financial pressures, but the first place to go shouldn't be hard-working people who already went through, if you're on furlough, you've been receiving only part-time of your wages, other people have lost their jobs. It's a very uncertain economic time. It's the wrong time to introduce this tax to people.
Fiona, thanks, Claire. I'll bring you back in a second. But Fiona, what about that point about the scope of efforts in Scotland? Do we know more? Is it a genuinely national care service, social provision as per the health service, or is it standards to be set for local authorities?
Well, the government has accepted the Feely report, and the Feely report set out a number of key principles. Certainly, standards were really important, making sure in terms of that retention and status and indeed pay of the workforce to ensure that we can have a strong and resilient workforce. All those things are there. The consultation is ongoing. And that's why I think everybody needs to embrace it, engage it. But of course, Scotland is a different starting place than the rest of the UK. We've already integrated a great deal of health and social care. And, we want people to live long lives, but live them well. And I think there is a kind of point about thinking what matters to us. It's not all care homes. We understand it's really important we support care homes, but most social care is in the community. And how do we help people live in their own homes longer? And there's some really important things that can be preventative in terms of support for the health service. I know that the hospital at home, for example, that programme was noted and with an indication to expand it by the Health Secretary only in the last few weeks. So we understand that that integration is important. But if we believe in the importance of social care as we go forward as a nation, then a national care service was in our manifesto. It was endorsed in an election in May, and people kind of expect governments to carry out their manifesto commitments.
Talking about manifesto commitments, there is an acceptance among the UK parties that there are powers that are devolved. But I mean, one of the elements of this has been that this is a tax primarily in the first instance to provide new services in England, but it is to be levied on a UK basis, a new tax, thereby bypassing the devolved tax structure, Fiona Hyslop.
Well, this is part of that kind of undermining of the devolution settlement, never mind, any other issues. And that's very worrying because at the initial stages of devolution, if one part of the UK was to do something that would adversely affect the other part of the UK, then there would be a compensation within that. And that would be within the block grant adjustment, as opposed to that kind of top slicing of funds then to be redistributed at the largesse of the UK government. So they're undermining their own position about trying to strengthen the union. They're actually weakening it by this measure. So not only is it unfair to all parts of the UK in terms of the youngest and the poorest paying most, it's also destabilising yet further the idea that somehow there's a respect agenda between the Westminster government and devolution.
Miles Briggs, what do you make of that?
Well, I was listening to what Fiona was saying and also thinking about the committee just this week, because we had the head of Hyslop at that committee talking about the lack of respect, this power grab which we're likely to see from ministers. And we've seen where things go wrong under this government, like the creation of a single police force. And I think there's growing concerns over what this will actually look like. I want to see local accountability. I want to see actually us empower communities to deliver care, because the best decisions are often taken as close to people as possible, not by ministers here in Holyrood. And I am worried that we've seen the widening of scope around what was originally put forward in the Feely report to include social care, to include alcohol services, to include children's services as well. And what's the point of us having local democracy and local authorities in Scotland any longer if the power grab we've seen by ministers have left them basically bin collections and dog poo?
What about Fiona Hyslop's accusations of a power grab by UK ministers bypassing the established devolution tax structure?
Well, this is the most simple way to raise the most money possible and then to distribute that. And that's exactly what ministers have looked to do. Claire touched upon what was, back in 2016 now, an attempt to build a consensus. Labour broke that at the general election when they created the dementia tax policy to try to scare people into voting Labour at that election. And I think that saw that consensus completely collapse. So
you say it's a simple way, but it's a simple way of bypassing Holyrood. There's a devolved system, very, very negotiated in huge detail over a prolonged period, and you just bypass it at an instant by creating a new tax.
Well, it's increasing the money Holyrood's going to have, and I never thought I'd be hearing complaints of that from ministers. What is key, I think, is that it provides that additional resources, and it does it more than actually be raised. Scotland will receive more money than actually taxpayers are paying into this. And Barnett Consequentials will make sure that we have that money to actually improve our health service, I hope.
Claire Baker, then finally Fiona on this point. Claire Baker first.
Just a couple of things. It was Labour that argued for a national care service, and I think that was back when Joanne Lamont raised concerns about the 6-minute care visit. And we argued for a model where there were national standards and where we could see the end to a postcode lottery of care. But I think I do share the concerns that have been expressed around the consultation that's happening at the moment. It is wider than the report. There are concerns from COSLA and other bodies that it's too extensive. But it's a consultation, so we are prepared to engage in the consultation, to engage in this process as a policy we supported. But I do have quite strong reservations about the way in which the government are approaching this. And Miles is right to raise some of the issues we've seen before with a power grab from local communities to a centralised government and the way in which Police Scotland was established.
Thanks, Claire. Fiona Hyslop.
The National Health Service was a major institution that was developed out of the major crisis following the Second World War in terms of welfare services. The pandemic, I think, demands us to be bold as to what we can do in terms of coming out of the pandemic. But I would warn Miles, the last time that a UK government unelected in Scotland imposed a centralising tax that didn't take into account the needs and indeed the income levels of the poorest and those across Scotland. It ended very badly for the Conservatives, and that was the poll tax.
Miles, a brief word on that?
Well, we can just score political points, or we can try to do something to improve the NHS and our social care system.
Or we can do both.
The cash, well, we will do both, given it's probably in our job title somewhere. But what is key, I think, is the money which is needed, which we are all, including the Scottish Government, the Scottish Government in all their independent reviews into social care say that more money is needed. They haven't adult social care. They haven't presented any reason where that's going to come from in this Parliament. And this is the £1.1 billion they're going to be provided. I hope this gets our NHS back up and running and then looks to the future around social care, because integration of health and social care by this government has failed. That's quite clear. And we need to actually look towards the future now, given all our demographic problems. And I think this hopefully presents that opportunity for us collectively as a parliament to do just that.
Can I just say, do not talk about demographic as a problem. I think we have to have respect for older people. So please don't describe demography issues and an ageing population as a problem. We want people to live long, but we want them to live well.
No, I totally agree. And we know the challenges, though, which we haven't met. We haven't provided.
I accept that.
Thanks for that. I'm older than all of you, so I would ask for a little respect from each of you as well. David Ball, there's a big vote in Holyrood tonight, isn't there, on COVID passports? Remind us what that's all about.
Yeah, so this is the latest sort of tool that the Scottish Government are hoping to bring forward to kind of improve vaccination rates, although they are very high. In the younger groups, there's a worry that they aren't quite picking up as quickly as they can. That is contributing to the sort of the spread of cases, although it's not transferring as yet too much to hospitals and deaths, although they are increasing. But essentially, you'll need to prove your vaccination status in order to gain access to some very high-risk areas, according to the government, sort of nightclubs and high-capacity venues.
Sporting events, yeah, that sort of thing. Yeah, okay. Claire, your party argued very vigorously against this, Anna Sarwar, in questions to the First Minister today, saying go down the road of testing rather than the COVID passports. But she said this could be the way to encourage people to take up inoculation. Do you accept there are arguments on both sides?
I do accept the arguments on both sides, and I think Anas has also made that clear that,
Yes.
on balance, this is what we think this is the wrong decision at the wrong time. I had a meeting last night with people from the music industry. They're really concerned about the future of their sector, which is just starting to open up. They're starting to make an income again. People across the creative sector are starting to enjoy returning to live events, and this puts a huge question mark over the viability of those events. And I do tend to think, I was at an event myself on Friday at the Corn Exchange. Everybody there had taken a lateral flow test. Everybody had their details recorded. I felt that was a safe event and it had enough safeguards and security in there to make it successful. I'm not convinced.
But Nicola Sturgeon pointing out, you can take Nicola Sturgeon pointing out in the chamber, you can take a lateral flow test, but they're not perfect. You might still have the virus, and you might go in there and spread it. Whereas
the vaccine passport doesn't change
of course,
that
but she was arguing it's a greater protection against that.
I suppose it's the balance between I'm not convinced it provides any greater protection in actually attending the event. There's a question over whether it increases uptake, and I've read reports that say you might see an initial spike in uptake, but then you risk isolating some people who are vaccine hesitant. So, on balance, we won't be supporting the government on this issue, though we have tried to work cooperatively across the pandemic.
Miles Briggs, this issue of whether to support the Scottish Government, I gather your party is not supporting the Scottish Government on this, and yet the Prime Minister is issuing introducing a comparable scheme for England. The Conservatives will obviously back that there.
Well, we make our own mind up in the Scottish Parliament, where as a party we'll decide what policies we support or don't. And we've been trying to get as much information all week from ministers, and only now have had a sort of flimsy pamphlet given to us. And I don't think this is right because it's been rushed. The Deputy First Minister, remember, said this was the wrong way to go. The UK government's, I believe, had a consultation of over 52,000 people responding. We've had 0 in Scotland. So how businesses are actually expected to put this in place, I don't think is clear, and certainly the documents which ministers presented are not acceptable. What will be interesting, of course, is we've now got all opposition parties voting against this, apart from those who are most vocal, which were the Green Party. So whether or not the Greens are going to actually stick to their principles on this, or just take the SNP whip tonight, we'll see. But this is where I think we need to get the government to think again on this, and I hope they'll listen to these concerns.
Thanks. David, remind us, the Greens are likely to vote. They're now in a partnership with the SNP, but how's the vote likely to go tonight? What's your forecast?
Yeah, we're expecting the Greens to vote with the SNP now. They've obviously formed that sort of loose coalition with them. Patrick Harvey last week, although they have opposed them in the past, he did say last week that the arguments have maybe changed a little bit on why the justification is there for that.
Yeah, he said they've got some reassurances, didn't he?
Yeah, that's right. So we'll have to see, but we expect the Greens to vote with the SNP tonight.
Fiona, what do you make of all of this?
I kind of agree with Claire that this has to be an unbalanced judgment, and some are falling one side, some are falling the other. Instinctively, over recent months, I've not been in favour of this move, as indeed you've heard from some other ministers. But we're at a particular point with the Delta variant. But I genuinely think that it's not just a hard and fast decision. It's why it wasn't made earlier. I think if you look at the experience across the EU 27 countries, and they're all doing it in different ways, because again, remember, the pattern and experience of the Delta variant is at different places in different countries. But I do think in terms of stopping transmission and also limiting hospitalizations, I think this is a step. And remember, it's 1st of October. There's more time to help develop it. So and it will end up being with the at the same time as the app as well. So
Fiona,
but I think it's the right thing to do. But I'm not saying
you say it's the right thing to do. But why no detailed consultation? Why generally you would have a committee hearing at least to hear the views of the nightclub organisation. You publish a document only this morning and expect MSPs to vote upon it this afternoon. That document doesn't even define what a nightclub is.
Right. So I'm not a government minister, but I do know that Government Minister John Swinney had been engaging with, and in fact, there's been engagement with events sector and the music centre over a long period, but it's specifically about these issues, because part of it is to make sure that they can develop it with them. But the risk is, and this is the really fine judgment, the risk is if we don't do this, does it lead, with the winter coming, with the potential for more transmission? Is there, or indeed a variant? Who knows what might happen? But the idea suddenly of closure again, and just as Claire was saying, these venues are starting to open up again, and it's an unbalanced risk as to what's from their point of view. Never mind the health issue, but from a sector point of view, do they want to risk having to close, or is a vaccine passport worth a price worth paying for them to continue to stay open? So I'm not saying it's hard and fast.
No, I understand.
Okay.
I understand. Miles, what about that? It's this or it's closure, because the cases are still rising, albeit there appears to have been something of a peak with regard to that.
I suppose all the measures we've tried to take have been around human behaviour, and this is one which I particularly don't like, because I think this is focusing on young people to try to say to them, you will have a vaccine before you can go and enjoy going to a nightclub. It seems a total mess from what I've seen in terms of they don't have a definition of what an actual nightclub is. And does this then see a further measures brought forward for bars and restaurants, for students returning to university if they're not double vaccinated?
Maybe it does. It's a global pandemic. It's killing thousands, millions. Maybe
where we are in terms of the vaccine, I think we should be proud of. Over 80% people have had at least one vaccination in Scotland. But we have all collectively tried to do our best in this Parliament with the powers we've given to the Scottish Government. This seems to be a breaking point now, where the government are trying to do something to influence people's behaviour, which isn't directly going to necessarily deliver for pandemic controls. And that's something I think we need to be careful about.
Thanks. Claire Baker.
Thanks. I do have a concern. I mean, it is the pandemic has, most people have pulled together, but there have been people who have been opposed to public health measures that have taken place. But this one, by far, is the one I've had the most emails about from people who are unhappy with this approach. And I think we do see greater consensus around testing, all those other kind of factors. There was more public buy-in. I do have concerns that this is a bit divisive and we might lose some support. I really hope that it's not, but it is the issue that people have come to me. I think what we do need, though, is more the test and protect system to be working better, and to make sure that people who are having to isolate are properly financially supported. That's been an ongoing issue, and that they are carrying out isolation properly, and that they're financially supported to do so. That's, I know the Scottish Health.
Thanks, Claire. Many thanks. Fiona Hyslop.
So I just think it should be limited and it should be temporary. And I think the fact that it will have to come back, is a testament to that. But it's not hard. I just think there's not a clear black and white in this. I think it's far more nuanced, and I think you've heard that actually from all the contributors. So it's not a decision not being taken lightly, but recognising there are an unbalanced judgment that has to be made. And I think from the public health point of view, this time, at this point, for a temporary, limited scope is the correct thing to do. Okay,
we'll see how that vote goes this evening at Holyrood, and of course you'll get that on the various Herald websites and platforms. David, we're focusing there on the COVID passports vote, but I mean, this has been the week in which Nicola Sturgeon set out the programme for government, loads of details on the bills in the next year and indeed plans for years beyond that, and of course the announcement of a further drive towards independence. Bring us up to speed, if you would, on that.
Yeah, that's right. So the SNP brought forward their programme for government, which they do every year, the government does. The big one that a lot of the unionist parties jumped on was the pledge for another independence vote, which was front and centre of the manifesto. It's quite obvious it was going to be brought forward. Nicola Sturgeon announced that the sort of work will restart to put that new case forward, that updated case for independence.
Yes.
She hopes to have the referendum held, COVID permitting, by the end of 2023. There's a lot of other policies in there, including a COVID recovery bill. Obviously, the plans for the National Care Service we've touched on. The contentious plans to sort of reform the GRA, the gender recognition.
Yes.
So there's quite a lot in there for Nicola Sturgeon to announce for the coming year and for the next 5 years as well.
And for the period beyond that as well. Miles Briggs, the significant one on the independence side, I mean, I was most interested in the economic stuff, but the significant announcement on the independence side was that a team of officials are now going to be working on basically a new white paper. We had a white paper, of course, in 2013 prior to the 2014 vote. Now we're getting a new one. I mean, you guys in the Tories and the other parties have been demanding details on various aspects of independence. You are now going to get it in terms of official civil service work. What's wrong with that?
I'm not sure if we will. And the white paper which obviously saw millions of pounds in civil service distracted ahead of 2014. And, that didn't present many answers to the questions which the SNP, I don't think, have really taken time to rethink since they lost that referendum. And I actually think, what the programme for government really demonstrated was the SNP could really do with the time out of office to start to think through the new programme they might want to put forward.
You'd be willing to give them a break, would you, Miles?
I think it's time they have a break, and maybe someone else stepped up for
somebody else, say the Tories, for example.
We'll do it under duress, but there's also
there's a minor detail of a democratic election in May, Miles, which you lost.
Tush, none of that.
Well, of course, if we're going to play games like that, the majority which Nicola Sturgeon, of course, said she was looking for failed to materialise, and now we've got the Greens in there as well, which is another issue. But, there's a poll out today, Brian, showing that only 37% of people in Scotland actually want another referendum in any time in the next 2 years. So I think even people who,
also suggests a majority for that very proposal, doesn't it?
Well, no, I think the key thing is
51%.
Time we need to look now towards our COVID recovery, and that's something I think even Fiona would probably admit should be the number one priority.
I've been teasing you wickedly, Miles, but do you think there's likely to be a referendum in the next few years after the next UK general election, perhaps?
No, I don't. I think actually what will be interesting to see is actually Nicola Sturgeon's future, because the council elections next year, and also whenever the next UK general election might be when people start to move away from the SNP, and I think we're starting to sort of see that, and some of the measures which people are putting forward, the Scottish Government are putting forward, I think are really going to see many of the core supporters of the SNP start to question their credibility. But it's about COVID recovery, and that's one of the key things. Regardless of our rosettes we stand and are elected on, we should all be 100% focused on. This is people's jobs, livelihoods, health.
That's true. Yeah. Okay. Fiona Hyslop, you've got a party conference this weekend, and again, a rather unusual one. Presumably it's one of these digital online things. But, I mean, there is some disquiet, to put it no higher than that, in your party about the pace of progress towards a further independence referendum.
Well, it depends who you speak to. When I talk to my branch members, no, there's not. And, in terms of where people are, they are pleased that we won and won decisively in May. I don't think MD could be under any illusion that the democratic mandate that was given to the SNP standing on a platform that we would hold an independence referendum. Yes, when we've managed to get through the most difficult parts of the pandemic. And I'm very conscious that there are still remaining challenges. We've just spoken about that. But we want to carry out our manifesto commitment. We want to prepare for that. And we live in a world that's quite changed since 2014. And this is about charting a way forward, yes, to achieve our potential as an independent country, but also to deliver the type of economic recovery and the type of social recovery and the climate change approach that we want. And you can only get that if you've got a divergence with the choices, the political choices being made by the UK government that don't suit Scotland, that are not elected, and government's not elected by the people of Scotland, that are bypassing us in terms of our powers, even under devolution, as you yourself pointed out, Brian, in terms of taxation. This is a choice. These are choices that have to be made, but they have to be made by the people of Scotland, and that requires the preparation and the steps to do so. So, Scotland needs to be independent. We'll have the potential to be a successful independent country. And, at times of transformational change across the globe, sometimes though that is reflected in the democratic changes within states. And Scotland is no different. Be under no illusion. The people of Scotland knew exactly what they were voting for in May, and we're carrying out that responsibility. But we will do so recognising the other pressures that we have to deal with as a government, not least the COVID crisis.
Talking about transformational changes, Brexit certainly comes into that. Now, Brexit would create a situation where if Scotland were to become independent and were to rejoin the EU, Scotland would have a land border with a non-EU country. How on earth would you cope with that? That would be the Ireland situation writ large, wouldn't it?
Well, the whole point is to make sure that we have a managed approach to this, which is exactly why we should be doing the work about the prospectus that was set out, which is others are criticising us for. That's exactly why we do that, and we learn the lessons absolutely of how not to do it in relation to what's happening currently. But it's very important to be a trusted partner particularly with the EU, and that's why Scotland's position within our relationships internationally are going to be so important, because what's happening with the UK, particularly with regard to Brexit, is unilaterally reneging on international agreements, and that just undermines the credibility. Scotland, particularly with the First Minister's leadership, is seen as a credible partner of choice, which will obviously help us in accessing, again, the free market of 600 million people.
Okay, Claire Becker, what do you make of the announcement that there's to be work towards a prospectus? Do you welcome that, or do you abhor the idea of there being an independence referendum at any point in the near future?
Well, I think Fiona is doing a bit of wishful thinking when it comes to the possibility of a border between Scotland and England. But when we see what's happened with Brexit and the situation in Northern Ireland, then. But in terms of the programme for government, I'm not supportive of a referendum anytime soon. We are still in the middle of a pandemic. Today, we're seeing cases that are some of the higher numbers we've seen altogether. People are facing the end of furlough, their prospect of losing their jobs. Kids have been out of school. Our NHS is huge waiting times. There's a huge backlog of health needs that need to be addressed. If the civil service are going to spend time working on an independence prospectus, I was here in 2012 through to 2014, and it just means the energy of government, the energy of the Parliament, everything focuses on the upcoming referendum and that divisive issue. And this is just not the time to be engaging in that again. The Parliament needs to be working together. The government have got to be fully focused. What will happen is everything gets seen through the lens, and where can an advantage be brought in terms of independence or against independence, and the parties go along those lines. And I don't think it's healthy for the Parliament to be doing that at this point in time. We need to be
Nicola Sturgeon's agreeing with you that now is not the time. She's talking about perhaps towards the middle or the latter half of 2023. Would that be acceptable to you?
Well, look, I think that's quite optimistic. I think that's underestimating the impact of the pandemic.
How about 24 then? How about 25?
How long that tail of it is. And I'm not going to put a date on it. I've already said, I went through the last experience. I know some people talk about it being a civic and joyous, and that wasn't my experience. I found it divided families, it divided communities. There was a mixed experience of the last referendum, and I don't think, as we come out of the pandemic, we should be spending our time discussing when the next one's going to be and investing resources into preparing.
So Claire, you say you don't want to put a date on. You say you don't want to put a date on it, but are you accepting that there is a democratic mandate to hold that referendum?
Well, we're in no different a situation than we were prior to the election, really. There was, that a referendum bill was already passed in Parliament because the SNP and Greens support that position, the other parties don't. So we're not. There's no different circumstances, and the coalition doesn't change that situation either.
To repeat the question, do you accept that there is a mandate for the SNP Scottish Government to go ahead with their independence referendum proposals?
Well, I think the public are at the moment saying they don't think they want to have a referendum at the moment. They're not supportive of us engaging in that division again. If there was to be a referendum, I think the last time we saw a settled agreement between the Scottish Parliament and the UK government, it needs to be a democratic, legitimate referendum if it's to go forward. And I don't think that's where we are at the moment. And I wouldn't want to see, I don't think the government are really proposing to have a wildcard referendum. I don't want to see us ending up in the courts, whether that's the Scottish Government spending time in the courts. The Parliament is tied up in that debate, a constitutional argument, where I think this Parliament needs to be focused on COVID recovery.
David, I'm right in saying, haven't I, that the First Minister is saying this is something that has to happen as and when COVID is passed or subsided. This too will pass, is the hope and the expectation. But she is also going ahead with preparations now. Is that the right way to see these things?
Well, I mean, yeah, you're right. She has said it's COVID permitting is when she wants to hold this referendum, and the SNP were re-elected on a manifesto promise that there would be a referendum in that timescale. The timescale hasn't particularly changed. It's still after the pandemic. And the white paper probably does need updating if they are to put that case forward, not least on the role that sort of oil and gas revenue, given the climate emergency we're facing.
Yes.
But it's a bit of an understatement to say it needs updating. When you talk about oil and gas, we've come through Brexit, we've come through a pandemic. There's quite a lot changed since 2014.
David, carry on. Yeah, thanks, Claire. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it is out of date completely, and I mean, if they want to put that case forward, they will need to be updated. It's fair enough to do that. The problem is when you've got government officials being taken away from other things to do that. But ultimately, it's going to be Boris Johnson's decision still whether this goes ahead in the same vein as it did in 2014. And as Claire alluded to, it could end up in a court battle where the court could put a Holyrood version of the referendum, could set it aside and say it's not lawful.
Okay, Miles Briggs. Claire Baker is saying not now, but she's not saying never by the sound of it. What are you saying?
I think Scotland needs another divisive independence referendum like a hole in the head. But I think one of the key things which we haven't really touched upon is Nicola Sturgeon needs to keep her base motivated. I don't know if Fiona has lost many of her members to the Alba Party. But certainly speaking to Edinburgh, I know a lot of...
They wouldn't dare, Miles.
I know, well, maybe Fiona's better at herding them to do what she needs them to. But in Edinburgh, I know a lot of older members of the SNP have gone to the Alba Party. So I think Nicola Sturgeon, and obviously she's got her confidence, has a lot of pressure from Alex Salmond trying to push her into this position. And, I get deja vu every time we hear this because
hang on a second. Nicola Sturgeon came just one short of an overall majority. Alex Salmond's party got 1.7% of the vote. What sort of pressure is that?
Well, you see from people who have left the SNP to go to the Alba Party, back to that actually, the whole independence coalition of voters in Scotland are screaming for Sturgeon to have this referendum.
Miles, I think you need to get out and about a bit more. I think politely.
Well, under your plans, none of us will be able to, Fiona. So it's maybe something we'll have to.
He's itching to go to a nightclub. Look at that.
You've had your double vaccine. No problems of going to your nightclub, Miles.
Oh well. So have I. I'll see you.
Fiona, seriously, is the First Minister under pressure on this one to hold the referendum more quickly than she is currently proposing?
No, she wants Scotland to be independent. She knows that we have to have a referendum to do that. We need the permission of the people of Scotland, and she wants to do that at a time that allows her to make sure that we've done what we need to do to get through the COVID pandemic. So nothing in that has changed. And if anything, we've got more of an endorsement because of more of an explicit position in the election that we had just in May. Now, remember in 2016, there was also a commitment for a referendum, but was premised on the EU exit, which nobody expected necessarily to take place. So when people were voting, particularly in the 2021 election, it was a far more explicit endorsement by the public for an independence referendum. So I think we're just doing what, one, we stood a platform on, and secondly, what the people voted for. So we are carrying that out.
Go on, Miles.
The last week of the election campaign, though, Fiona, Nicola Sturgeon said this wasn't about another referendum. She pivoted very much towards just her record. Every leaflet which will have gone across your constituency had, the podium she'd spent the last year standing at, saying this was about her leadership, not about another referendum. And that once in a lifetime, once in a generation pledge she made to the people of Scotland in 2014, I think she should really start to listen to her own words then. We need to move on as a country and get recovery as our key focus.
And we need to move on, and we need recovery, and we need transformation. There's no going back. There's no going back to where the society or indeed the economy was previously. We know that. The issue is, who do you want to guide us through that in terms of leadership in party, but also in terms of the First Minister, but also in terms of the type of constitutional state that Scotland is best placed in to do exactly that, to recover and transform our society.
Claire Baker.
I suppose one of the things I was thinking as well, when Miles earlier talked about the UK government, and so did Fiona, if you look at who is also fueling the current constitutional debate, Boris Johnson, the Tories don't help the situation. The way in which, I do agree, the way in which they engage with the Scottish Parliament doesn't really build relationships in the way that would make people see the value of the union and make us stronger as a country. So, I would like to see Labour in government at UK level, because I think we established the Scottish Parliament, we understand devolution, we do need a system across the UK that works better for everybody and that that works better for Scotland. But the current Conservative government, I think, are undermining that. Forgive
me, Fiona, final word. Give me a date for this referendum, 23?
Well, I think if that looks a good suggestion in terms of the timing. But I think again, in the words, we went through pandemic, but I think that would make sense for lots of different reasons.
Thanks all for taking part. Thanks to Claire, Miles, Fiona, and to David. Thanks to all of you for listening through the various platforms, none of which I understand, but lots of clever people do. From me, Brian Taylor, toodaloo.
This podcast was brought to you by The Herald. Take 20% off an annual subscription to The Herald with our exclusive podcast code. Just add HeraldPod 2021 to your basket and get instant, unfiltered access to our website. And you can also get involved with the Brian Taylor podcast as well. Tune in on Facebook, Twitter and YouTube every Thursday afternoon to catch Brian and his panel chat live and ask your questions to the people across the political scene.